No, a goldfish does not have a 3-second memory. No, the North Star is not the brightest star. No, coal doesn't turn into diamonds. Surprised? There are literally hundreds of more pieces of information where that came from in my book, Facts That Aren't True. Click the link in the description to learn more. Molecular biologist Douglas Prasher pioneered the idea of using a protein called GFP that you get from jellyfish. Prasher would take this protein and attach it to other proteins in living things, and it would stick to them and cause them to glow. The importance of this really cannot be understated. If you've ever seen pictures of glowing lab animals or pictures in science textbooks that show cells with glowing parts in them, that's because of Prasher. He isolated the GFP gene, and then in the late 1980s, he freely shared it with other scientists, including Martin Chalfie and Roger Sen. Due to some incredible bad luck and the loss of his grant funding, Prasher was forced out of science just as his idea was taking off. He ended up in debt, he started doing odd jobs, and he was essentially not even in the science community anymore. And then in 2008, while he was driving a shuttle van for a living, he heard on the radio that Chalfie and Sen had won the Nobel Prize for his discovery. Prasher was invited to the ceremony as a guest of honor, and he eventually did get back into science as a scientist, but his story is a really painful example of how justice is not always served and how the culture of science sometimes fails. Prasher is somebody who absolutely should have won the Nobel Prize, and there are many more. Today, though, I want to talk about people who should not have won the Nobel Prize, the most controversial Nobel Prizes. There's really only one example that I have in mind where the person definitely should not have won the Nobel Prize for what they won it for, but there are not others that are without controversy. Not surprisingly, most of these are with regard to Nobel Peace Prizes. For example, in 1973, Henry Kissinger shared the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a ceasefire for the Vietnam War. Now, the war was by no means over. It went on for a few more years, and critics had said that Kissinger was responsible for so many deaths in Cambodia and Chile that he just did not deserve to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Vladimir Putin and Joseph Stalin, they have both been nominated for peace prizes, but they've never won them. But these are certainly controversial nominations. Hitler was actually jokingly, sort of, more of a protest, nominated one year. It was either 1939 or 1938. And the reason he was nominated, like I said, it was basically a protest because Neville Chamberlain had been nominated. But one person who had a role in nomination thought that Chamberlain was so incredibly incompetent that, well, you might as well nominate Hitler. And so he did, but the committee very quickly took away that nomination. Should be noted for this that happened before the broader public knew of the true horrors that were going on. It actually occurred a few years before the final solution began to be carried out. Mussolini was also reportedly nominated, but he was never a finalist. Barack Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, just a few months into his presidency, and even Obama jokes that he didn't deserve the prize. He gave a speech, a very powerful speech that was what he was best at doing, where he called for nuclear disarmament and a future of peace in the world. Yasser Arafat shared a Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 for peace negotiation efforts between Israel and Palestine, but there was incredible violence that really never ceased, and Arafat was considered a terrorist by a huge number of people. Antonio Moniz in 1949 won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the lobotomy Yes, the inventor of the lobotomy won a Nobel Prize for that. In 1993, Kary Mullis won the Nobel Prize for the invention of polymerase chain reactions, or PCR, which, again, the importance of those is very, very hard to understate. But the controversy came from Mullis, the person being an AIDS denier, a climate change denier, and somebody who peddled astrology. So there were many that thought honoring this person was troubling. Final one worth mentioning is perhaps Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates has never won a Nobel Prize. I'm not sure if he's even ever been nominated for one, but he's utterly obsessed with winning a Nobel Peace Prize. And while his work on eradicating polio and malaria, it is just, if Bill Gates ever won a Nobel Prize, it would be forever questionable if Gates did all of that just so that he could win a Nobel Peace Prize, rather than for the sake of doing it. Oh, and the Epstein's Island and all that. Now, I would argue that none of those are the most controversial. While some of these individuals were certainly questionable for moral and ethical reasons, and some of the awards were based on a hope and a prayer rather than real results, they were awarded for something that the individuals actually did. I mean, even lobotomies occasionally worked. That was not the case, however, for the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1938. It turns out that the specific accomplishment for which the award was given didn't actually happen. Enrico Fermi. He was an incredibly important and influential figure in physics in the 20th century. In the early 30s, he experimented with radioactive elements by putting them in paraffin wax, and this slowed down the neutrons that they expelled. This experiment it actually misled Fermi and the rest of the scientific community to believe he had made a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. The data that Fermi collected suggested that the neutrons flying out of the radioactive elements were combining with neighboring elements, increasing their mass, and then inducing them to become new, heavier elements. The discovery of the first trans-Uranian, heavier than uranium element. This was an incredible discovery, as many scientists believed that elements heavier than uranium couldn't even exist. Alas, while elements heavier than uranium do exist, Fermi did not, in fact, discover them. Nonetheless, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering transuranic elements in 1938. What Fermi had actually discovered, although we can't use the word discovered, more like accomplished, since he was unaware of what was actually happening, what really happened was nuclear fission. And it turns out that the neutrons were not growing the atoms surrounding them in the paraffin wax, but they were actually splitting them, producing lighter known elements. For all we can tell, this was the first time that an experiment had accomplished that task. The process was officially discovered by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in 1938. That's the year Fermi won the Nobel Prize, but it was about 4 years before that, I believe, that Fermi did his experiment. Hahn alone, for some reason, I don't know why, won the Nobel Prize for his discovery in 1945, the discovery of fission. If Fermi had known what he really discovered, the prize for the discovery of nuclear fission would almost certainly have been his. Now, embarrassingly, it was revealed a few years after Fermi won his Nobel Prize that he had not, in fact, created new heavy elements. So therefore, Fermi did not accomplish what he won the Nobel Prize for. This is why I believe his prize is the most controversial. It's essentially illegitimate. Nobody else has ever won a prize for something that they didn't actually do. There are many strict rules for Nobel Prizes. They cannot be awarded posthumously. Only 3 people at most can share a Nobel Prize, and they cannot be taken back. On many occasions, though, a category goes unawarded because the committee determines that there are no worthy recipients in that category, although that has not happened since 1972. In 1940, Edwin McMillan and Philip Abelson correctly identified element 93, which they called neptunium, and the first true discovery of a heavier than uranium element had happened. McMillan would share the Nobel Prize in Chemistry with Glenn Seaborg in 1951.
To recognize your achievements, I hereby award you the Nobel Prize in, chemistry.
Glenn Seaborg discovered or co-discovered 10 elements, more than anyone in history. Ironically, the element seaborgium, which is obviously named after him, was not discovered by him. For the record, there are 13 elements named after people. Another rule is that an award cannot be won more than once for the same thing. Fermi had unfortunately been falsely credited with an award for the discovery of the first transuranian element. So that is a Nobel Prize worthy award, but it had already been awarded, but Fermi didn't actually do it, but some other people later did it. Well, now what do we do? Well, that 1951 Nobel Prize in Chemistry officially reads, for their discoveries in the chemistry of transuranium elements. Elements, plural. That was the committee's way of, I guess, awarding somebody for a prize that had technically already been wrongfully awarded. None of this is anybody's fault. It's just unfortunate. Well, it's not even unfortunate. It's actually just kind of funny. Fermi won a Nobel Prize for something he didn't do. What he did do, he didn't realize, and somebody else won the Nobel Prize for. Then later, Fermi's discovery went to its rightful discoverer. Kitty Cat Peterson and I hope you enjoyed that video, and we will see you tomorrow.